Hello, folks. Have you ever been asked the question, if you could, where would you like to travel? You ever heard that one? I know I've been asked that question. Not a lot, but I think it's one of the most frequent questions that folks are asked. And when I'm asked that question, like I said, it hasn't been much. Um, um, I have a couple of areas that come to mind right off the bat. Not a lot. Um, but how do you answer it? How do you answer it? If you haven't had to field that question, then stop and think about it. Stop and think about that for a moment. And some folks, me and certainly included, think of think of a certain subregion that we're going to be taking a look at and exploring this week. The islands of the South Pacific. Welcome back and greetings, folks. We are looking at this in the prism. If we're looking at this in the prism of a football game, we are now probably late in the third quarter, chapter 10 of a fourth quarter game, or perhaps in the early stages of the fourth quarter. If we're talking baseball, we are probably just beginning the seventh of 9 innings. We do not do extra innings here or overtimes, right? Because on the syllabus, once we get to the final, unless there's some kind of a um, um, serious circumstance, mitigating circumstance, the course is over the day of the final, right? So turn to page 436. All that being said, turn to page 436, and as you're heading there in your textbooks, regardless of how late in the game we are, right? We are beginning the 10th of 13 chapters in the course, and that, of course, is drumroll, Australia, Oceania, and that includes those in the South Pacific Islands, and Antarctica. Antarctica. Yes, here in World Geography 100, we give not only the island nations of Oceania, but Antarctica some love as well. So aside from those pouched animals on Australia, not much is said about the region, unless you're talking to someone about vacation spots, right? And I like those island nations out there in the South Pacific appeal to me when thinking about that. As for the island nations, so as not to mix them up with um, Southeast Asia that we looked at earlier, we and most geographers delimit um, the island nations from, and you can see on page 436, from Papua New Guinea south and east out across the international date line. Let's look at where we're going to be going here. In this chapter, we some of the major heads up terms I think you need to know about outright here. The Great Dividing Range, that is a mountain chain. You can see that on page 436. In Australia, over along the eastern coast. I guess some areas of that do touch the coast, pretty near the eastern coast of Australia. Land case, the land case. I want to highlight that area of interest to me in this study. New tree campaign that started in the 1990s in Australia. We'll develop that a little bit deeper. The Aborigines. Aborigines native Australians, the original indigenous peoples there. The Maoris, you have to roll the R's there, right? Native New Zealanders, right? The native indigenous group to New Zealand. The white Australian policy, a subject of interest. Immigration policy in Australia, some would say at times controversial. Okay, Oceania is the all these Pacific islands, including Australia, the largest, obviously, of the Pacific islands. New Zealand included as well, and I think that's about it for this. For the heads up terms. Where we want to go here, the objectives, we want to compare and contrast the backgrounds, economies, cultures, and politics of the various subregions here. We want to explain the advantages and disadvantages of the tourism industry, certainly in the island nations. And we want to justify, right, I said we want to give Antarctica a little love here. We're going to focus on it with one of the objectives. We want to justify whether Antarctica should be considered its own continent, right? We're including it, as most geographers do, in this particular region here of Oceania. But we want to justify whether it's its own continent or it should be, in fact, delimited, along with our study this week. So just kind of setting this up here before we get into the lecture model here. The South Pacific lies along a transition of environments and peoples. The region is one of contrasts you have, and we've seen this in some other regions as well, right? Some of those are among the world's wealthiest. Some of you folks are, well, all of you guys are doing your papers, and we'll talk about that a little bit today for the first time. You guys are doing your papers on the Economic Freedom Index and looking at various countries, and Australia has emerged in the last 10 years or so in the top 5, right, of the world's wealthiest countries, while others in this sub-region are among the poorest, right? And again, we've seen that before in some other places as well. There are many indigenous groups practicing traditional and tribal lifestyles, but the region is yeah, as I'm looking at the map here, it's playing an increasingly larger role in global affairs and economics. And in fact, until recently, this region was characterized by geographic isolation and a history of domination by external powers. Europeans, the Chinese, South Asian influences have played a significant role in defining cultural, political, and economic character of this region. Let's look at the X-raying this here now for things I want you folks to know. And let's take a look at Australia. Right, Australia was integrated, looking at the lecture model now, integrated into the global economy. And as I say here, in fact, it is one of the world's wealthiest nations. Australia houses large deposits of iron ore in Western Australia, rocks from the Great Dividing Range of East Australia, as well as providing coal and silver among many other minerals. And you take a look at your map on page 454, we'll take a look at another more detailed inset map of Australia, the Great Dividing Range. Again, toward the east coast, page 454, you can see that. European explorers, all right, European explorers came upon Australia in the 1800s. Basically reproducing Western culture. However, they did not engage with the indigenous population, in this case, the Aborigines. figure 10.2, figure 10.2, you can see a photograph of Australia's Western culture. Now, there have been regulations, getting back to the mining I talked about along in the Great Dividing Range. There have been regulations on that, on the mining licenses during recent years have been necessary because of the effects of some of the mining extractions. The federal government, too, I should probably add, has legislated a campaign to build new trees. Right? Yeah, I wanted to cover I wanted to cover this. I almost skipped over it. A campaign to build new trees, which began in the 1990s. Under the title "The Land Case." Right, the land case. And here the goal was to plant a billion new trees to meet the climate targets, which were in accord with the Paris Accords during that time period. New Zealand, like Australia, New Zealand has been integrated into the global economy. And page 454, if you're unfamiliar with the region, you can see New Zealand at the bottom right of the page on your maps. Relief from the elevations. You can take a look at the geographic map there. You can see the elevations. So relief from that, from the elevations on New Zealand, and the runoff from the subsequent rainfall provide a fair amount of hydroelectric power. So it provides a lot of access to that fair amount of hydroelectric power. Now, because of the size of New Zealand, there's limited natural resources that exist in the country. Like Australia, Europeans arrived in the 1800s, reproducing Western culture there as well, while not integrating with the indigenous peoples. Political decisions must be made in regard to some controversial farming practices, auto emissions, and new dams that are being constructed. I don't want, because of time, I don't want to develop this too much, but folks always ask, in my live classes, well, some folks ask, well, what's up with the farm practices? And basically, what's allegedly been going on there, it's around cow induction. And a hormone is used to cause cows to calve prematurely. They bring back late cows in line with the rest of the herd, preferably at 6 or 7 months. The thing is, though, and this is what's controversial, a large number of those are born dead. And I debated right up to this very second here. I downloaded a article on a paper, and you can look at your map of New Zealand there out of the Waikato Times. And Waikato is a region just south of Auckland, the largest city in New Zealand, the upper island of New Zealand. And you can see it on page 450. I downloaded a article written by a farmer that was in the Waikato Times. And of course, the farmers are not taking this lying down. They're basically saying, without giving you a little more backdrop to this, like reading the whole article, they're basically saying that they're really upset at the bad publicity they're getting, with the news media. And they state that basically the reason they're doing this is there are economic benefits to it. So there you have that. The Oceanic Islands. And on page 459, photos 460 and 61. 459, you can see a more of an inset of the islands. Photos 460 and 61, there are some photos of these islands. But these islands here have not been integrated into the global economy, although there was some early contact with European whalers. Economically, it is dependent on external aid. Nevertheless, not without precious metals and minerals. And the precious metals and minerals out on these islands um, include copper deposits. You have nickel ore in New Caledonia. And again, you can, on your inset map, you can see these islands, New Caledonia, and you have rainforest on some of the larger islands like Papua New Guinea. Contact with the Europeans in the 1800s, although the Europeans did not engage with the islanders. Page 442, you can turn there. Interesting inset map there of Antarctica. Basically, Antarctica has been a scientific research lab. Okay, you have trans Antarctic mountains there that are rich in mineral resources. And as you can see on figure B, many countries claim segments of the continent. And you could take, you could take a stop stop the video and take a look at some of those countries. And geographically, you'll see that the countries that are, I think for the most part, that are making claims, and you take a look at a world map and juxtapose Antarctica, with the world map, it would probably make geographic sense of some of those countries that are laying claim. Some others, maybe not so much. I'm going to turn to page 454. I want to start looking at comparing and contrasting the economies, cultures, politics of these countries, or these nations with against one another. Before I get there, though, I just want to talk about briefly, as I like to do, talk about the climates. We're not going to really dwell on these for quiz material, but this is geography, so right, we'll take a look at these. The region's climates are largely tropical, right? No surprise there, except for Antarctica, right? Big contrast there. Largely tropical and heavily influenced by these oceanic influences. Australia's vast interior is dominated by arid and semi-arid climates, pretty much uninhabitable there. You have moist subtropical and mid-latitude climates are found at the region's northern and obviously the southern extremes. This region is home to a wide variety of animal and vegetation types, including the distinct marsupials of Australia, right? Those pouched animals, the kangaroos. Deforestation and soil degradation and mining damage are among key human-induced environmental problems faced by the South Pacific countries. All right, let's look at Australia. The economy of Australia. Sheep farming enticed early immigrants from England and Europe. Gold mining boom occurred there in the late 1850s, bringing more immigrants. Now, the immigrants were mainly from England. If you take a look at your map there on page 454, port cities were established. Australia maintained economic contacts in the time period with Europe. Free trade was therefore opened. And again, getting back, if you take a look at the map of Australia, their geographic map, You have that outback of the the inland part of Australia was uninhabitable. So uh, you know by default you have your civilizations being set up along the coasts. Culture of Australia. The Aborigines were already on the continent when Europeans arrived, and the Aborigines were basically nomad hunters. Page 446, figure 1010. There is a photograph of small Aboriginal community. The Dutch arrived in Australia in the 1600s, then the Brits, right? We saw this with, in Africa, sub, south of the Sahara, right? In southern Africa, the Dutch were there, the Boer farmers, and you had the Boer War, and the British kicked them out. British arrived after the Dutch here as well. Actually, the British, interesting note here, is that they were looking for a penal settlement. They were looking for a penal settlement for impoverished Brits who couldn't pay off their debts. And but the interesting thing was, the British had a penal settlement here in the colonies, right? Well, the something happened, right, in the late 1700s over here, the American Revolution, right, and with the victorious colonists were more than glad to expel the British out of the colonies, and the Brits had to find another place, right, for their uh, debt-ridden criminals, and so they were looking here at Australia. And again, the Australians, the Aussies, paid little attention to the Aborigines. Today, the Aborigine population comprises about 2% of the continent. You're reading, which I'll dwell on a little bit later, you're reading in your textbook deals with the Aborigine population. They make up about 25% to 30% of the Australian prison population, right? So we want to examine that a little bit, and that will uh, lead to a discussion question. The politics of Australia. The government was forced to get involved in national infrastructure due to the early influx of the settlers. They established the Commonwealth in 1901 and established, therefore, a white Australian policy that encouraged European immigration, while at the same time discouraging immigration from other parts of the globe. Again, this was primarily aimed at luring in British immigrants. 1972, there was a policy change that included migrants from all over the globe. And then high unemployment ensued by the 1990s, and that led to national curbs on immigration. In the last decade, boat people have been intercepted and shipped to internment camps on Nauru, igniting outcries from human rights groups. And if you look at your map on page 459, you'll see the Solomon Islands. That'll be pretty obvious to you. And just north of that, you'll see the island of Nauru. And one of your in the news options, I'm asking that you guys do some research. Hopefully, some of you do, and talk about what's the state of those internment camps, right? And it's an interesting option for your in the news. And well, to be honest with you guys, I get some people to do my dirty work for me. I don't have time to do all this research, and that's an interesting one. And my students, some of my students, keep me abreast with those types of things, and I thank you very much. Urban change in Australia. concentrated in urban areas, the population along the coasts. And you have a population distribution map that you can look at there on page 450, figure 1014, right? And you could see by that I'm not lying about this. So, and obviously location fuels much trade. 90% of the population, you can see it there, live in the cities because of the development of those ports that we talked about earlier and the uninhabitable nature of the interior. Table 10.2, page 451, is a population table of Australia and Papua New Guinea. Right, you have some age-sex diagrams there, or population pyramids to look at of Australia and Papua New Guinea. Again, Papua New Guinea, if you take a look at the map, page 450, just north of Australia. New Zealand, head southeast here, and the economy of New Zealand, sheep farming burgeoned in the 1880s with the advent of refrigeration, but most of their exports went to Europe. Like Australia, they maintained economic contacts with Europe, as well as conducting open free trade. The service sector is a fast-growing sector of New Zealand's economy. Much emigration, a lot of people emigrating out to Australia for employment. Because of the size of New Zealand, not a lot of natural resources, so employment can get crowded there, and a lot of folk emigrating to the many cities, the port cities of Australia. Culture. I mentioned at the top of all this the Maoris, and you got to roll that R when you say that. I have that on your heads up terms there for your spelling. They arrived in New Zealand from the South Pacific in the 800s, 800 AD. They resisted British missionaries. The Brits encouraged emigration of British farmers onto New Zealand as they did in Australia. Unlike the Aussies, however, the Aussies, their outlook toward the Aborigines in Australia, they basically isolated them. The New Zealanders respected the Maori land ownership, right? More immigrants came to New Zealand due to an 1860 gold rush. Also, the politics of New Zealand. New Zealand gained political autonomy from England 6 years after the Australians did. This was in 1907. The Maoris integrated much more easily into culture here in New Zealand than the Aborigines did in Australia. Thinking ahead, I taught this for a long time, and my recall is accurate here. This looks like a good quiz question, comparing the integration between these two cultures in their respective nations. Urban change. 86% of the folks in New Zealand live in urban areas. Since the origin of the cities were ports. And you can see page 454, your inset map. You can see New Zealand, right? Auckland and some of the other cities there, right, along the coasts. As a result, these cities act as links to overseas markets and the country's interior. Let's move to the island nations. And a lack of global political and economic influence has negatively affected the living standards of the island nations of Oceania. Tourism, though, tourism provides the greatest potential for the island countries to improve their quality of living. Economic difficulties, internal strife, economic and military dependence upon outsiders such as the French and the United States are, as I say here, an impediment toward regional development. Figure 1013, page 449, there's that chart I like. And you can compare standards of living around the region, right? Consumer goods, water access, right? You guys get the picture. Now, this is probably stating the obvious, but there are a few natural resources, for the exception of copper and gold in Papua New Guinea. Touched on this a little earlier, the nickel in Caledonia, and there's phosphate on the island of Nauru. The countries, as you can see, are small in size. Therefore, and New Zealand again is not too much different from this, a little bit bigger, but therefore they're just not big enough to diversify, which is a large part of the problem. There has been a large scale cutting of timber, expenses of maximum sustainable yield of fish life. And I had that as one of my heads up terms, maximum sustainable yield. I could tell you what that's about right now. And maximum sustainable yield, didn't mention it at the top of all this. Maximum sustainable yield of fish life. For instance, if people are fishing, people eat a lot of fish there for their diets. The warning is don't overextend the fishing there to the point where we can't make it back to the baseline, baseline number of fish to where we were at, when we started fishing. Don't deplete it beyond getting back to sustainable usage again. So, and then this depletion of resources, looking at the lecture model again here, the fills, this depletion of resource goes for the same as for the phosphate that's in Nauru. Lastly, Antarctica, page 462, take you back there, page 462, and we'll flip back and forth between that and 464. The countries send commercial cruise ships there with tourists to the continent. And again, if you look at page 464, figure 28B, it has a photograph of a cruise ship. So countries send commercial cruise ships with tourists to the continent, while others, and the United States included in this, reserve the right to make future claims on the continent. There were and we looked at that earlier. You can see the countries making future claims. There were regulations in 1982 to curb commercial fishing. That hasn't gone any farther than that last time I looked. Commercial cruise ships take tourists to the continent. Figure 1029, 1029 figure A. You can see, pigeons and some wildlife there. At present, last time I looked, there are no treaties regulating tourism. There must be permits, though. That's the one thing that's changed since the 2015 edition of this book. There must be permits. Cruise ships include helicopters. Folks will take the helicopters and go over and ski on Antarctica, and you have mountaineers that like to ski, and you have folks that like to visit the South Pole. Treaties have been signed as a basis to keep Antarctica from being exploited, right? No surprise there. Although research stations do pour, I spelled that wrong there, do pour unwanted sewage into the ocean, as well as dump oil drums in areas that are used by birds for nesting. Right? We looked at some of our pigeon friends on one of the page 464, and then you can look at figure 1027 as well. So there you have that. Your graphic organizer, right? Certainly for you visual types, I encourage you folks to go over that, right? It highlights all the points and breaks down all those little details as well. All right. So I know some different things are going to be popping up on this week's up ahead sign. And, get my video panel up there. First, you got your graphic organizer there. Your videos, couple videos. I got traditional, and they're short. You guys know that. Traditional customs in Papua New Guinea and Fiji, the islands and life. Basically, audio visuals here that I think both of these kind of encompass the general tenor, of all the island nations. Readings, page 447, the Aborigines and the New Americas, and the exploration of Antarctica on page 463, a more scientific perspective of that. Again, as you guys know by now, these all tie into your discussion questions. I'm going to need to see bits and pieces of these in there to get those perfect tens. And of course, they'll help you with quiz information. And then Thursday, we got in the news, and Friday, Sunday, the response posts. But and then Monday, we make our way into the Western Hemisphere, Latin America. But 23rd is coming up, right? As I am, as you guys are seeing this, probably most of you are seeing this lecture. It's about 2 weeks out, but the starting to peek over the horizon now, right? If I was to make a sign here, it might be a smaller one up on a hill, right? You were in my classrooms. I do all these artistically. I would have a hill, and I'd have the billboard maybe with the paper up on top of the hill, just peeking over the horizon. But it is coming up, November 23rd, the papers, right? So there you have it. And that's a wrap on Australia and the Antarctica and the oceanic islands. Any questions, comments, concerns? You know how to get a hold of me. Thursday night, debriefing night, if you're so inclined. So, with all that being said, you guys have a great week, and hopefully you guys do well in all the rest of your classes, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.